Whispers in Blackwood Forest. Chapter 1. The journey begins. The sun was beginning its descent as Alex, Sarah, Mike, Lisa, and Tom piled into Alex's old, reliable SUV. The excitement was palpable. It had been a while since the five friends had managed to coordinate their schedules for a weekend getaway. The destination, a remote camping spot deep in Blackwood Forest, far from the prying eyes of civilization. Alex, the de facto leader of the group, had suggested the location. He'd been there once before with his family years ago, and the memory of the untouched beauty and tranquility had stayed with him. Sarah, Alex's girlfriend, was thrilled at the idea of an adventure and a break from her stressful job. Mike, always the skeptic, was tagging along more out of a sense of duty to his friends than any real desire to camp. Lisa and Tom, the bubbly, adventurous souls, were ready for anything. The drive was filled with laughter, stories of past escapades, and playful teasing. They had packed all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, a cooler filled with food and drinks, and of course a portable speaker for music. As the forest loomed closer, their excitement mixed with a slight edge of nervousness. Blackwood Forest had a reputation, but they all dismissed the tales as nothing more than local folklore. After what felt like an eternity on the winding forest road, they finally arrived at the secluded campsite. The trees stood tall and imposing, their branches weaving a dense canopy overhead. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine. The site was perfect, far enough from any trails to guarantee privacy, but close enough to a small creek for water and a quick swim. They wasted no time setting up their tents, the practiced motions of seasoned campers. Alex and Tom took charge of the tents while Sarah, Mike, and Lisa gathered firewood and set up the makeshift kitchen area. Before long, the camp was ready, and the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to dance among the trees. As darkness enveloped the forest, they lit a campfire. The flickering flames provided a cozy warmth and a sense of security against the encroaching night. They sat in a circle, passing around a bottle of whiskey to take the chill off the evening air. The conversation turned to ghost stories, a staple of any camping trip. Lisa, with her flair for the dramatic, began to recount a tale she'd heard about Blackwood Forest. They say, she began, her voice low and hushed, that a long time ago, a group of settlers vanished without a trace right here in these woods. Some say they were taken by a malevolent spirit that still haunts the forest, looking for new victims. Mike snorted. Come on, Lisa. You don't really believe that, do you? It's just a story to scare tourists. Lisa shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. Maybe, but wouldn't it be fun to find out? The group laughed, though the sound was a bit forced. Despite their bravado, the oppressive darkness and the eerie stillness of the forest had them all on edge. They continued to talk and laugh, but every now and then, their eyes would dart to the shadows just beyond the firelight, as if expecting something or someone to emerge. As the night wore on, fatigue began to set in. One by one, they retired to their tents, the warmth of the fire giving way to the cold grip of the night. The forest, silent and watchful, seemed to close in around them. Alex lay next to Sarah in their tent, her steady breathing a comforting reminder of their closeness. Yet, as he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He told himself it was just the ghost stories playing tricks on his mind. But as he finally succumbed to sleep, the forest remained, its secrets hidden in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Chapter 2. The first night. The first night in Blackwood Forest was eerily silent. Alex stirred awake several times, each time straining his ears to catch any sound. He wasn't sure what had woken him, the rustling of leaves, a distant owl, or perhaps the echo of Lisa's ghost story. He glanced over at Sarah, her form barely visible in the dim light of their tent. She seemed to be sleeping peacefully, oblivious to his unease. Across the campsite, Mike was having trouble sleeping as well. He lay on his back, staring at the fabric of his tent, which fluttered lightly with the breeze. He cursed himself for letting Lisa's silly story get to him. As logical and rational as he was, there was something about the forest that felt off. He turned over, willing himself to sleep, but the sense of being watched persisted. Outside, the fire had died down to glowing embers. The forest was a dark expanse, with shadows stretching out like grasping fingers. The trees whispered secrets to each other, their leaves rustling softly. The moon, hidden behind a thick veil of clouds, offered no light to pierce the gloom. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the stillness, a low, mournful wail that seemed to float through trees. Alex sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. He listened intently, trying to determine if the sound was real or a figment of his imagination. After a few moments of silence, he shook his head, deciding it was just the wind. But the wail came again, louder and more distinct this time. It was followed by the sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. Alex nudged Sarah awake. "Sarah, did you hear that?" Sarah groggily opened her eyes. "Hear what?" "That noise. It sounded like ... someone crying." Sarah listened for a moment, but the sound had stopped. "It's probably just an animal, Alex. Go back to sleep." Alex wasn't convinced, but he didn't want to alarm her. "Yeah, you're right. Sorry for waking you." He lay back down, still on edge. Meanwhile, Tom and Lisa were also awake. Tom had heard the noise too, and was peering out of their tent, trying to catch a glimpse of what might be causing it. Lisa, though initially skeptical, felt a chill run down her spine. "Tom, do you see anything?" Tom shook his head. "No, but I'm going to check it out." "Stay here." "Are you crazy?" Lisa hissed. "Don't go out there alone." "I'll just be a minute," Tom insisted, grabbing a flashlight. "I'll be right back." He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold night. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the surrounding trees. He scanned the area, his breath visible in the chilly air. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching his every move. Tom took a few steps away from the tent, his senses on high alert. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He turned in a slow circle, the flashlight casting long shadows. Just as he was about to give up and head back, he saw something, a figure standing at the edge of the light. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness. Tom's heart raced as he took a step closer, trying to get a better look. But as he did, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. Tom stumbled back to the tent, his mind racing. "There's someone out there," he whispered to Lisa as he zipped the tent shut. "I saw something." Lisa's eyes widened. "What do you mean? Was it an animal?" "No," Tom said, shaking his head. "It was ... human, I think. But it disappeared." Lisa shivered. "Let's wake the others. We need to stay together." They hurried to wake Mike, Alex, and Sarah. Soon, all 5 of them were huddled around the dying embers of the campfire, their flashlights creating a small circle of light in the vast darkness. Alex relayed what he had heard, and Tom described the figure he had seen. "We need to be careful," Alex said, his voice steady despite his fear. "If there's someone out there, we don't know what they want. Let's stay together and keep the fire going." As they stoked the fire back to life, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the shadows danced more menacingly in the flickering light. They took turns keeping watch, but the night seemed endless, each minute dragging on with unbearable tension. When dawn finally broke, It was a welcome relief. The light of day dispelled some of the fear, but the memory of the night's events lingered. They decided to stay close to the campsite and keep their eyes open for anything unusual. Little did they know, the true horror was only beginning, and the forest had no intention of letting them leave unscathed. Chapter 3: Unease Grows. The morning light brought a semblance of normalcy to the campsite, but the events of the night left a lingering tension among the friends. They decided to stick together as they explored the surrounding area, hoping to find answers or, at the very least, to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over them. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the forest seemed almost serene in the daylight. Birds chirped, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. They came across a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the foreboding atmosphere of the previous night. However, their sense of unease grew as they stumbled upon strange symbols carved into the trees. The markings were crude and haphazard, some resembling twisted faces, others abstract patterns. Sarah ran her fingers over one of the carvings, feeling the deep grooves etched into the bark. "These look ancient," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity and apprehension. "What do you think they mean?" Mike, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "Probably just some pranksters trying to scare people, or maybe it's old graffiti from hikers." But Alex wasn't convinced. "There's something more to this. These symbols feel ... deliberate." As they continued their exploration, they found more unsettling signs: circles of stones, charred patches of ground, and remnants of what looked like makeshift altars. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of being watched became. They decided to turn back when Lisa spotted a shadowy figure in the distance, standing perfectly still among the trees. "Guys, over there," she whispered urgently, pointing towards the figure. The friends froze, their eyes straining to see through the thick underbrush. The figure remained motionless, its form blending with the shadows. After a few tense moments, it seemed to melt away into the forest, leaving them shaken. "We need to get back to camp," Alex said, his voice firm. "This place isn't safe." As they retraced their steps, the forest seemed to grow darker, the trees closing in around them. The path back to their campsite felt longer, and the silence was oppressive. They walked faster, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Back at the campsite, they tried to make sense of what they had seen. "Maybe it's someone messing with us," Tom suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or a hermit living out here." "Whatever it is, we need to stay vigilant," Alex replied. "We'll keep the fire going tonight and take turns keeping watch. We can't let our guard down." The day passed uneventfully, but the tension never lifted. As evening approached, the shadows lengthened, and the forest took on a menacing quality. They gathered around the campfire, the flickering flames casting eerie patterns on their faces. To lighten the mood, Sarah suggested they share stories about their lives and their hopes for the future. For a while it worked. They laughed and reminisced, the camaraderie easing some of the fear. But as the night deepened, the oppressive silence of the forest returned. They took turns keeping watch, their eyes darting to every rustle and movement in the darkness. During Lisa's watch, she heard a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. She strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, a ghostly murmur that sent chills down her spine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Tom, who was next to her. Tom nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah, I heard it. It's coming from the trees." They woke the others, and together they listened to the disembodied voices that seemed to surround them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still, the words were unclear. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to them, trying to communicate something sinister. As the night wore on, the whispers faded, but the fear remained. They huddled together, trying to draw comfort from each other's presence, but sleep was elusive. The forest watched and waited, its secrets hidden just beyond the firelight. By the time dawn broke, they were exhausted but relieved to see the first light of day. They decided to stay close to camp, their spirits dampened by the relentless sense of dread. They knew they couldn't stay another night in Blackwood Forest, but leaving seemed equally daunting. Little did they know, the true horror was only just beginning, and the forest had no intention of letting them escape its grasp. Chapter 4. The Warning. The morning was shrouded in a thick mist, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy of trees. The friends were weary, their faces marked by fatigue and worry. As they gathered around the campfire, a palpable sense of dread hung in the air. Alex was the first to break the silence. "We need to figure out what's going on here. We can't keep ignoring the signs." Mike, ever the skeptic, sighed. "Look, we're just freaking ourselves out. We should pack up and leave. This place is getting to us." Just as the debate began to heat up, a rustling sound caught their attention. Emerging from the mist was an old man, his clothes tattered and his face lined with age. He walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a wooden staff. The friends tensed, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Morning," the old man greeted, his voice rough but steady. "I see you're camping in Blackwood Forest." Alex stepped forward, wary but polite. "Yeah, we are. Who are you?" The old man chuckled, a sound that was more unsettling than comforting. "Name's Walter. I live nearby, though nearby in these parts is still a good hike away. I come here from time to time to check on things." Sarah, always the kind-hearted one, offered him a seat by the fire. "Would you like some coffee, Walter?" Walter nodded gratefully, taking the cup with a shaking hand. "Thank you, miss. You folks seem like nice people, so I'm going to give you some advice. Leave this place. Now." The friends exchanged nervous glances. "Why?" asked Lisa, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter sighed, his expression grave. "This forest ain't what it seems. It's got a history, a dark one. People vanish here, always have. Some say it's the spirit of a man who was wronged. Others say it's something older, something evil." Mike scoffed. "Come on, Walter. You don't really believe that, do you?" Walter fixed him with a piercing gaze. "Believe what you will, boy. I've seen things in these woods that would make your blood run cold. You felt it, haven't you? The feeling of being watched? The whispers in the night." The friends fell silent, the truth of Walter's words sinking in. Alex spoke up, his voice firm. "We did. Last night we heard whispers, and Tom saw someone in the forest." Walter nodded slowly. "It's trying to scare you, to break you down. Once fear sets in, it gets stronger. You need to leave while you still can." The gravity of Walter's warning was clear, but leaving was easier said than done. The forest seemed to close in around them, and the path back to civilization felt impossibly long. Yet, staying another night was out of the question. "Thank you, Walter," Alex said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll pack up and leave as soon as we can." Walter finished his coffee and stood, his eyes softening with a touch of sadness. "Good luck, kids. I hope you make it out. Just remember, the forest doesn't like to let go." With that, Walter disappeared into the mist, leaving the friends with a renewed sense of urgency. They quickly began to break down their campsite, their movements hurried and tense. The forest seemed to watch their every move, the weight of its malevolent presence growing stronger. As they packed, Sarah pulled Alex aside. "Do you think we'll be okay?" Alex took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "We have to be. We just need to stick together and stay calm. We'll make it out." But as they prepared to leave, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The forest had its hooks in them, and it wasn't going to let go easily. They could feel its presence, a dark force lurking just beyond their sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. With their gear packed and their spirits steeled, they set off down the path, the way back feeling more treacherous with every step. The forest seemed to shift around them, the mist thickening and the trees closing in. Little did they know, the true horror was yet to come, and the forest's grip was tightening. Chapter 5. The second night. The journey back through the forest was slow and arduous. The mist hung thick and heavy, obscuring their path and amplifying the sounds of the forest. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them jumpy and nervous. The friends huddled close together, their eyes darting around, trying to pierce the veil of fog that seemed to swallow them whole. As the day wore on, it became clear they were not making much progress. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, and the trail they had taken now felt unfamiliar. Panic began to set in as they realized they might be lost. "We should have been out of here by now," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Why does everything look the same?" Alex tried to remain calm. "Let's take a break, regroup, and figure out our bearings." They stopped in a small clearing and spread out a map, but the dense fog made it difficult to pinpoint their exact location. Mike, who had been silent for most of the trek, finally spoke up. "We might need to consider the possibility that we're not just lost, but being led astray." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I mean," Mike continued, "that whatever is out here might be manipulating us, keeping us from finding our way out." The idea sent a shiver down their spines, but before they could discuss it further, a low, mournful wail echoed through the trees. It was the same sound Alex had heard the night before, only now it was closer, more insistent. "We need to keep moving," Tom urged. "Staying in one place is making us sitting ducks." Reluctantly, they packed up and continued their march, the eerie wail following them like a sinister specter. As dusk approached, the mist thickened, turning the forest into a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes. They knew they needed to find a place to set up camp before darkness fell completely. They found another small clearing and hastily set up their tents, the oppressive silence broken only by their labored breathing and the occasional snap of a branch. As night descended, they huddled around a small fire, their faces illuminated by its flickering light. The whispers began again, faint and elusive, carried on the wind. This time there was no mistaking their origin. They were coming from the forest itself, a chorus of disembodied voices weaving in and out of the darkness. Lisa clutched Tom's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "It's like they're talking to us. What do they want?" Mike, whose skepticism was now replaced by fear, shook his head. "I don't know, but we can't let it get to us. We need to stay strong." As they sat around the fire, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The shadows seemed to dance just beyond the light, twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. The friends took turns keeping watch, but the relentless whispering and the oppressive atmosphere made it impossible to relax. During Lisa's watch, the whispers became almost deafening. She stood, trying to pinpoint their source, when she noticed a movement in the shadows. Heart pounding, she shone her flashlight towards the trees and saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. "Guys, wake up," she hissed, her voice shaking. The others scrambled to their feet, their flashlights joining hers. The figure stood motionless, its features obscured by the darkness. As they approached, it vanished, leaving only a cold, empty silence in its wake. "What the hell was that?" Tom whispered, his voice filled with fear. "I don't know," Alex replied, "but we need to stay together and stay vigilant." As the night dragged on, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The whispers seemed to close in around them, the forest pressing in like a living entity. Fatigue and fear took their toll, and despite their best efforts, sleep began to claim them one by one. In the darkest hours of the night, Sarah was the first to notice Lisa's absence. She woke Alex, panic in her eyes. "Alex, Lisa's gone. She's not in her tent." They quickly woke the others and began searching the campsite, calling out her name. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking their efforts. They found Lisa a short distance from the camp, standing in a trance-like state, her eyes wide and unseeing. "Lisa," Sarah cried, shaking her friend. "Wake up." Lisa blinked, her eyes focusing on Sarah. I heard them calling me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "They want us to stay." They brought Lisa back to the camp, but the encounter left them all shaken. They huddled together, their fear palpable. The forest seemed to tighten its grip around them, and they knew they were running out of time. As the first light of dawn broke through the mist, they were exhausted but determined. They had to find a way out, but the forest had other plans. The true horror was only just beginning, and the malevolent presence that haunted Blackwood Forest was growing stronger with each passing moment. Chapter 6. The Revelation. As the first light of dawn broke through the mist, the friends were exhausted but determined to find a way out of Blackwood Forest. The previous night's events had left them shaken, but their resolve to escape was stronger than ever. They gathered their belongings and set off, hoping that daylight would make navigation easier. The forest, however, seemed to have other plans. The dense foliage and twisted paths made it feel as though they were walking in circles. Every tree looked the same, and the oppressive silence only added to their growing sense of despair. After hours of futile wandering, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been inhabited for years, with its weathered wood and broken windows. Despite its eerie appearance, they decided to investigate, hoping to find something that could help them. Inside the cabin, they found a dusty, cluttered room filled with old books and strange artifacts. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. As they searched the cabin, Mike noticed a large leather-bound book on a rickety table. "Look at this," Mike said, picking up the book and blowing off the dust. "It looks like some kind of journal." They gathered around as Mike opened the book, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes and drawings. The entries detailed various rituals and spells, along with warnings about the malevolent spirit that haunted the forest. As they read, it became clear that the previous occupant of the cabin had been trying to summon and control the spirit. "This is insane," Tom said, shaking his head. "Who would want to mess with something like this?" Mike's face grew pale as he read further. "Guys, I think I know who." The others looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked. Mike took a deep breath and confessed, "I brought us here on purpose. I've been researching the legends about this forest for years. I wanted to find out if they were true." The revelation hit them like a punch to the gut. Alex's eyes blazed with anger. "You did what? You put all of us in danger for some twisted curiosity." "I didn't think it was real," Mike protested. "I thought it was just stories. But now I see I was wrong." The tension in the room was palpable. They were furious with Mike, but they knew they had to stay focused if they wanted to survive. Sarah flipped through the journal, searching for anything that could help them. "Wait," she said, pointing to a passage. "It says here that the spirit can be banished using a specific ritual. We just need to gather the right materials." Alex looked skeptical. "And you think we can trust this? What if it makes things worse?" "We don't have much choice," Sarah replied. "It's either try this or keep wandering until we become its next victims." Reluctantly, they agreed to attempt the ritual. The journal listed several ingredients, most of which were common in the forest. They split up to gather what they needed, keeping a wary eye on their surroundings. As they worked, the forest seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and the whispers more insistent. They hurried back to the cabin. the weight of their task pressing down on them. Once they had everything, they followed the instructions in the journal. They drew a circle on the floor with salt, arranged the ingredients in the center, and began to chant the incantation. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped as they spoke the ancient words. At first, nothing happened. Then, a low growl echoed through the cabin, and the ground began to tremble. The shadows coalesced into a dark, swirling mass, and the malevolent presence that had been haunting them appeared before their eyes. The friends held their ground, continuing the chant despite their fear. The spirit lashed out, its anger palpable, but the circle of salt held it at bay. As the ritual reached its climax, the spirit let out a final, deafening roar and dissipated into the air, leaving the cabin eerily silent. For a moment they stood in stunned silence, hardly believing what had just happened. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the forest seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. But their relief was short-lived. As they stepped out of the cabin, they realized the forest was still a maze, and they were no closer to finding their way out. And then they saw a fresh set of symbols carved into a nearby tree, identical to the ones they had seen before. The realization hit them hard. The spirit might be gone, but the forest itself was still alive, still watching, still hungry. They had banished the spirit, but their nightmare was far from over. Chapter 7: Descent into Madness. The relief of banishing the spirit was fleeting. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the oppressive atmosphere returned with a vengeance. The trees seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. The air was thick with tension, and the feeling of being watched was ever present. The friends moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. They were physically and mentally exhausted, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them. Despite their best efforts, they could not shake the sense of impending doom. As night fell, they set up camp once more, their movements slow and mechanical. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and their own ragged breathing. They took turns keeping watch, but the fear and exhaustion made it difficult to stay alert. During Tom's watch, he heard a faint whispering, like voices carried on the wind. He strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, a ghostly murmur that set his nerves on edge. He shook Lisa awake, his voice trembling. "Lisa, do you hear that?" Lisa rubbed her eyes and listened. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Yeah, I hear it. What do you think it is?" "I don't know," Tom replied, "but it sounds like it's coming from all around us." The whispering intensified, and the shadows seemed to dance at the edge of the firelight. The other friends woke, drawn by the eerie sound. They huddled together, their fear palpable. "It's the forest," Alex said, his voice filled with dread. "It's trying to drive us mad." The whispering grew louder, more coherent. They could make out fragments of sentences, disjointed and haunting. "You can't escape. You belong to us. The forest will consume you." Sarah clutched Alex's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "What are we going to do?" "We need to stay calm," Alex replied, though his voice betrayed his own fear. "We can't let it get to us. We have to find a way out." But the forest had other plans. The whispering continued, relentless and maddening. The friends tried to ignore it, but the words burrowed into their minds, sowing seeds of doubt and paranoia. As the night wore on, the whispering took on a more personal tone. Each friend heard their own fears and insecurities voiced by the unseen entity. Lisa heard whispers of betrayal, of her friends plotting against her. Tom heard accusations of cowardice, of being a burden to the group. Sarah heard doubts about her relationship with Alex, whispers of infidelity, and mistrust. The constant barrage of voices began to take its toll. Lisa snapped first, her eyes wild with fear and suspicion. "I can't take it anymore," she screamed. "I know what you're all thinking. You blame me for this." "Lisa, calm down," Alex said, trying to soothe her. "We're all in this together. No one blames you." But Lisa was beyond reason. She backed away from the group, her hands trembling. "Stay away from me. I don't trust any of you." Before anyone could stop her, Lisa ran into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. Tom started after her, but Alex held him back. "No, Tom, it's too dangerous. We can't lose anyone else." "But we can't just leave her out there," Tom protested, his voice filled with anguish. "We'll find her in the morning," Alex said, though he wasn't sure they would. "For now, we need to stay together." The night dragged on, each minute an eternity. The whispering continued, wearing down their resolve. They took turns keeping watch, but sleep was elusive. By the time dawn broke, they were exhausted and on edge. They set out to find Lisa, their hearts heavy with fear. The forest seemed even more sinister in the daylight, the trees casting long, twisted shadows. They called out her name, but there was no response. As they searched, the whispering returned, taunting them with Lisa's fate. "She's gone. The forest has taken her. You'll never find her." Despair began to set in. They were lost, their friend was missing, and the forest seemed determined to consume them. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on their minds, pushing them to the brink of madness. Finally, they found Lisa's scarf snagged on a branch. It was the only sign of her, and it did little to reassure them. They pressed on, their hope dwindling with each passing moment. As the sun set once more, they were forced to return to camp, their spirits broken. The whispering grew louder, more mocking. The forest had claimed its first victim, and it was only a matter of time before it took the rest. Chapter 8: The Final Stand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the friends huddled around their campfire, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. They knew they couldn't survive another night like the last. The forest seemed to grow more malevolent with each passing hour, and the whispering voices were relentless, gnawing at their sanity. "We need to come up with a plan," Alex said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We can't just sit here and wait for the forest to pick us off one by one." Sarah, her eyes red from crying, nodded. "But what can we do? We tried following the paths, but they all lead us back here. It's like the forest is alive and it's toying with us." Mike, who had been quietly studying the journal they found in the cabin, spoke up. "I think there's something we missed. This journal talks about a ritual to banish the spirit, but it also mentions a way to protect ourselves from the forest's influence." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Mike flipped to a section near the back of the journal. "There's a protection spell. It requires us to create a circle of protection and stay within it until dawn. If we can hold out, the forest's power over us should weaken, and we might be able to find our way out." Alex looked skeptical but hopeful. "It's worth a shot. We don't have many options left." They quickly gathered the necessary material: salt, candles, and herbs they found in the cabin. Following the instructions in the journal, they drew a large circle around their campsite and placed the candles at equal intervals. As they lit the candles, the flickering flames cast an eerie glow, illuminating their determined faces. They sat in the center of the circle, their backs to each other, forming a tight-knit group. The whispering voices grew louder, almost deafening, but they held firm, chanting the protection spell in unison. The air grew cold, and the shadows outside the circle seemed to writhe and twist, but the barrier held. Hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity. The forest seemed to rage against their defiance, but the circle of protection remained intact. Exhausted and terrified, they clung to each other, their hope flickering like the candle flames. Just as dawn began to break, the whispering stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the forest seemed to recede, its malevolent presence retreating with the light of day. The friends looked around, their faces etched with relief and disbelief. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We survived the night." Alex nodded, his voice filled with cautious optimism. "Let's pack up and get out of here before the forest changes its mind." They quickly gathered their belongings, careful not to disturb the circle until they were ready to leave. As they stepped out of the protective barrier, the forest seemed less menacing, the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting a warm glow on the path ahead. Following the journal's instructions, they found a narrow trail that led them out of the forest. The journey was arduous, but their determination to escape fueled their steps. Finally, they broke through the dense foliage and emerged onto a familiar road. They stood there, taking in the sight of civilization with a mixture of disbelief and joy. They had made it out of Blackwood Forest, but the experience had left its mark on them. The memory of the malevolent presence and the whispering voices would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As they walked towards the nearest town, they couldn't help but look back at the forest, its dark secrets hidden once more. They knew they had been lucky to escape, and they vowed never to return to Blackwood Forest. But as they disappeared down the road, a faint whisper echoed through the trees, a reminder that the forest was still there, waiting for its next victims. Chapter 9. No Escape. As the friends stumbled out of Blackwood Forest and onto the familiar road, a wave of relief washed over them. They had made it through the night, survived the malevolent whispers, and escaped the forest's grip. They thought the worst was behind them. They walked towards the nearest town, their steps weary but filled with hope. The sunlight felt warm and comforting, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness they had left behind. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts, the memory of Lisa's disappearance and the horrors of the forest still fresh in their minds. As they approached the town, Sarah noticed something strange. The road, which should have led them directly to the main street, seemed unfamiliar. The buildings looked old and abandoned, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. An uneasy feeling settled over them. "Are we sure this is the right way?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Alex checked the map and frowned. "This doesn't make any sense. We should be in town by now." Mike, who had been quiet since their escape, spoke up. "Maybe we took a wrong turn. Let's keep going and see if we find anyone who can help." They continued walking, but the town seemed deserted. The streets were empty, and the silence was eerie. It was as if the place had been abandoned for years. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step. They finally reached the town square, and their hope turned to despair. In the center of the square stood a statue, weathered and covered in moss. It depicted a tall, thin figure, its features obscured but unmistakably familiar. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. "It's the figure from the forest," Tom whispered, his voice filled with dread. "The one we saw that night." The friends exchanged horrified glances. The realization that they had not truly escaped the forest's grasp sank in. They were still trapped, caught in some twisted supernatural loop. "We need to get out of here," Alex said, his voice trembling. "We need to find a way back to the real world." They retraced their steps, trying different paths, but every road led them back to the same deserted town square. Panic set in as they realized the full extent of their situation. The forest had ensnared them, creating an illusion of escape only to trap them in another nightmare. Desperation fueled their actions as they frantically searched for a way out. They pounded on doors, shouting for help, but there was no response. The town remained silent, a ghostly echo of the forest's malevolence. As night began to fall, the friends huddled together in the center of the square, their hope dwindling. The familiar whispers returned, louder and more mocking than ever. The figure from the statue seemed to come alive, its shadow stretching out towards them. "We can't stay here," Mike said, his voice shaking. "We need to keep moving." "But where can we go?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "We're trapped." Tom looked around, his eyes wild with fear. "There has to be a way out. We can't give up." With renewed determination, they set off again, choosing a random path in the hope that it would lead them out of the nightmare. But the forest had other plans. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows deepened, enveloping them in darkness. One by one, they succumbed to the forest's malevolent influence. Tom was the first to go, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. The others tried to hold on to each other, but the forest's power was too strong. Mike was next, his screams echoing through the empty streets as he was pulled into the darkness. Sarah and Alex, the last remaining, clung to each other, their fear palpable. "We can't let it take us," Alex said, his voice a desperate whisper. But the forest had no intention of letting them go. The whispers became deafening, and the shadows closed in around them. In a final act of defiance, they held each other tightly, their eyes closed against the impending darkness. As the forest consumed them, the last thing they heard was a mocking whisper you can never escape. The town square fell silent once more, the statue standing as a grim reminder of the forest's power. Blackwood Forest had claimed its victims, and its secrets remained hidden, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander into its grasp.